So I'm just going to go through this funny little picture that I created, and it seems to have got people really seem to like it. The context I did it in was actually that I'd come across Kris De Meyer's work. I also was following Livvy on LinkedIn and knew some of her work. And I was just really inspired that about this idea of that we need to be telling stories differently. And I wanted to do a little post on LinkedIn about it, and I couldn't find an illustration. And at the time, I happened to have really bad COVID. My temperature was well above 38, but I had to stay awake because my funny little dog, Puppy, I just couldn't leave her all day on her own. So I was trying to stay awake, and I thought, oh, I'll just try and draw a little picture. So I did this, leaning up against a window, tracing over some of the little pieces of it. So it all made one picture. And the house in the bottom right is a bit wonky because at that point the dog was pulling on my trouser leg. And I plonked it on the side, took a photo and thought, I'll just go and make myself a cup of tea. And then the dog got the piece of paper, scrunched it, got paw prints all over it. And I just thought, oh, I give up. But I didn't. And I did my post on the same day, stuck this little picture at the bottom of it. And that post went nuts. And it was all about how do we need to start communicating in a way that inspires action and using story to do that. And so I'm just going to start by introducing myself a little bit around this little, I'm not purporting that I'm a hero here, but just what's been my adventure here. And so I did indeed start out, my known was environmental science, landscape ecology, working in regulatory bodies and with NGOs, wielding sort of science and law, and thinking that that was going to make a profound difference. And I had some big wake-up calls when trying to convince a farmer that he had to speak to me about anything he did on his land, because there were some rare orchids there. And then he was pretty hostile, not unsurprisingly, and I had a port threaten me physically with violence, head of a port, if I found anything of nature interest in his channel approach. And it was just not really working as a way to persuade other people that there was a better future if we could all look after nature and climate. So I then took a job managing a coastal area, a big story in itself, but lots of hostility and conflict there. And I heard about this approach called consensus building, and I thought, right, I think this is what we need here. And I crossed over my bridge from my known to my unknown, and my unknown was all the people side. So not the science and the law, but what's all the people side of all of this? And I set out on doing this consensus process. This is going back about 25 years. And I didn't really have any allies. I had lots of people trying to obstruct and block what I was doing. I definitely had to face down some enemies, both within my own organisation who were terribly scared that we were moving away from just science and just law to something more collaborative and cooperative and about discussion. And then that all led to me setting up Dialogue Matters about 22 years ago. And since then, we've done all sorts of fantastic work, and we have indeed, as an organisation, won a whole bunch of awards. And we're not here around the participation side of what we do, but we train people and we facilitate lots of different dialogues. We've done about 120 so far, local, international, and global scales, and so far in about 28 countries in the world. So I'm always on this journey of kind of like, how can we do better? What does better look like in any sphere? So I've also gone around this journey in terms of just more straightforward communication. And I hope that I'm at sort of number 8 now, sort of telling and inspiring others what I've learned. And that I know many of you are from communication backgrounds, so you'll probably know in some ways far more than I do around this. But I know a lot of environmentalists don't know this the kind of stuff we're talking about today. But if you're here with some of that knowledge, please, when we're into the workshop bits, feel very free to share it and tell us all what you know. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit first in this introductory bit about understanding ourselves. And I'm not here, I know now that many of the people booked on this aren't straightforward environmentalists. So when I say understanding ourselves, I'm meaning environmentalists who've chosen this as a profession and got that science grounding, and then on this journey of trying to understand, well, how can we influence more effectively and inspire more effectively? And this comes from some work by Chris Rose, and he identifies, I don't know if this is his model or it came from somewhere else before, but anyway, that there's 3 kinds of people. So I'm sure there are multiple different models that can divide up people in different ways, but this is based on our unconscious drives and behaviours and our unmet needs. So there's settlers, And settlers are people who are very security driven. They want safety. They want to feel like they belong. They're quite risk averse. Then over the other side, there's prospectors, and they're sort of much more outer directed, want this success and esteem of others. They want displays of symbols of success. So I don't know, big cars and big yachts and I don't know, big houses. And that's what works for them. And then there's pioneers who are inner directed, much more sort of about values and experimenting and ethics. And when the person who developed this model tried it out at a conference that I was at, a coastal conference, and I can see that the person who, Bob, you organised all of that, is here. So it was Coastal Futures back in 2019, and Chris Rose did a quick survey on us all, and that is who was in the room. So the primary group in the room were pioneers. So mainly environmentalists, some sort of engineering, some people interested in fisheries. So right across the sort of the marine spectrum, but primarily pioneers in the way we think about life. And so understanding that, and understanding that we're a bit skewed and a bit different, is really helpful to understanding that actually then, as pioneers, we have for sure got certain needs, but then so do the prospectors and settler types. So we need to sort of think about tailoring our communication to others. We also really need to be aware of our own group think, that we're in this sort of bubble of how we think. And we have quite a lot of wrong assumptions about how things work, and some of those are going to be unstitched this morning. And we really urgently need to learn from other kinds of science, so social science, psychology, behaviour change science. And again, we've got some speakers this morning who come from that world and can tell us more about that. But part of our group think has been that the challenge around environmental change is an information deficit. Other people need more information. If we can just get them information, then it will all sort itself out. But we kind of miss out on a few things here. So we miss out on something called inattentional blindness, so our brains only see what's relevant at the time. So if you're talking to somebody about something environmental and it's not relevant to them at that time, then they're just, brains are not able to absorb it and connect with it and see it. We also have confirmation bias, so we see what confirms our own worldview and then actively seek it out. And of course, social media has massively amplified that. We love technical language, stats, graphs, maps. Well, that's how we communicate with each other, but actually they're not at all well understood. I've seen people drawing on maps thinking they're drawing something really, really tiny, and they've taken up a quarter of a large town in what they're trying to draw. And they're just trying to draw, we need a new environment centre here. And they've actually just driven their sense of scale, their sense of reading the map. It's a form of literacy, and they don't have that. And likewise, stats don't really work for a lot of people. And we also trigger an array of psychological reactions that we're unaware of. So having thought that they need a load of information, we then think people need to logically analyse that information. But most behaviour is shockingly not governed by the rational part of our brain. And when I discovered that, having got my science degrees, I was pretty shocked. But it turns out that about 95% of our decisions are made using heuristics, and heuristics are decision shortcuts. So it takes lots of energy to make decisions, and our brains want us to take the easiest way out of doing that. And I think Livvy's going to talk a bit more about that later this morning. So then what are those shortcuts? And there's actually a myriad of them. This is just a short little list, but there's actually loads of others. But I mean, it sort of is something easy. You're anchored to the first thing you know or think about. Optimism bias, you think that we all think that we're better drivers than everybody else, but we can't all be right. And I won't unpick any of these more than that, because we are going to be looking at some of these over the course of the morning. The time of day can really make a difference. So I would strongly recommend, if you're ever in a criminal court, do not let the judgment happen on you mid-afternoon. Get your legal team to push it to the next morning, because there's something about decision fatigue and how many decisions we can make in a day. And if you're in a very high decision environment, which a legal court is, then by the middle of the day, the brain of the judge is going for the easy decision. It's just like, send them to prison. So judgments bought sort of from mid-afternoon onwards are send them to prison as the easy option. So yeah, just have a little warning around that. And then just your mood. So I don't know, you have a crump on your car on the way in, or you argument with somebody, or your dog runs off, or I don't know, your tech doesn't work or whatever it happens to be, which puts you in a bad mood, or something puts you in a really good mood. And all of those things can affect how you understand information, the decisions you'll make in the light of that information. So we're going to learn lots about all of that today. But before we press on, I just want to address this little thing about nature and climate. So I'm deeply frustrated, as I'm sure many people are who care about the whole picture, that climate, I mean, climate needs all the help it can get. Don't misunderstand me, but it's almost like we think it's all about climate and that nature doesn't count as well. But actually, they're just two sides of the system, and it's an absolute accident of history of when the global conventions were agreed and way decades ago, and it was decided that they would separate climate and nature. And so it's just an accident of history that we've separated these things. But fundamentally, they're part of a system in trouble. So nature, climate provides the conditions for nature to flourish, and nature regulates climate. And all of this system is in huge trouble. The water system, the carbon system, the nutrient systems, they're all in trouble because of what we're doing as human beings. So today I put nature first. Initially, this was climate and nature. I thought, no, I'm going to reverse the sort of prioritization, if you like, and put nature in front of climate. But we've got to start thinking about these things as integrated systems and taking action with both in mind. And so what today's event is, we're going to hear from some great speakers. I'm very, very sorry to announce that Kris De Meyer has had to pull out. He had his mother died on Monday, and he just had to drop everything and go to his family. And we obviously, send our condolences to him. However, I have got his paper, and I have put together over the last day a presentation of his work. So I'm not giving his presentation. He didn't even have time to get it to us or anything. So, and we've also sorted out a class or a kind of workshop-y bit, interactive bit, based on his theories and his practices. So we're going to have those talks, then we're going to learn together in breakout workshops. And I really want to emphasize this is together. So we are all coming with richness of knowledges, experiences, understanding, some from that environmental science background, some not. But we all are learning together. I know we've got journalists on the call. I know we've got people who work around mentoring and counselling and coaching. I know we've got just such an array of people on this call, on this meeting together, and that's really exciting. But I'm absolutely convinced from seeing the material that you will go away with new insights, new skills, and some new tools and resources. The interactive groups will be in parallel. So we're just trying to work out how we can get some of the information from one and share it with you after the event, and we will be finding a way to do that. And the outcome we really aspire to in doing this event is that we can all find new ways to go away after today and inspire others to hope and action. So whether that's your friends, your family, your community, whether that's sort of outward to business, media, other citizens, or whether that's your colleagues, the people you work with, each other in the profession or whatever profession you're from, or other sectors. So, and of course, there's many other categories I could add to this. I was just sort of using our logo as a bit of a game there to try and set something out. But whoever you are communicating with, at whatever level of governance, in whatever sphere, then we need to be inspiring hope and action. And that's what I hope you'll have from today. So Joel, I just think I'm handing over to you for a moment.
Yeah, thank you, Dana. Just a quick hello from me. My name's Joel. I'm Deputy Director of Dialogue Matters. And I've been working with the company for over 7 years now. And so today I'm just going to be chairing today. So I'll be introducing speakers and then taking your questions to the speakers at the end of the presentation. So I'll be keeping a close eye on chat. If a question comes to mind in the middle of a talk, please feel free to put it in chat, and I'll be watching that. So yeah, back over to you, Dana.
Okay, so this is about transforming the stories we tell. And I'm going to talk about conventional approaches and why they don't work. What does catalyze change, a bit about storytelling, but I'm speaking there as very much as somebody learning, and I know we've got journalists and storytellers on the call, so I'm sure you might be able to sort of develop your thinking or advise us more when we get into the interactive bit, and then what we can all do in the light of that. I'm just going to pause a moment because I haven't got my, there we go, presenter view up, good. Right, so there's quite a bit wrong with the conventional approach, and I actually alluded to it in my introduction. I didn't know that Kris was going to cover it too. But fundamentally, our conventional wisdom has been issues that we need to communicate our stories in an issues-based way. So 98% of environmental stories are negative. And the framing is all about the issues and the threat, and that's right across. So Kris and his team look right across news, TV shows, art, science articles, right across the piece, and 98% was negative. And that's all been based on this assumption that increasing understanding and awareness and concern and even fear is the thing that catalyzes action and behavior change. And it turns out that is really flawed. It triggers this array of negative psychological reactions. And it also has really narrowed our understanding about what it is we need to do to sort of actions of consumption. So like, what do you consume, what do you eat, what do you buy, you know, whether you fly or not, or activism. And it is so much richer than that. There's so much more that we need to be thinking about doing than all of that. So the current messages have all these kind of words: doom and disaster, existential threat, loss of our life support, it's urgent, it's a crisis, it's an emergency, it's beyond our control. And these are the messages that the 98% of communication is giving out. And that has caused an uptick in concern. So we've got much higher levels of concern than we had before. So 82% in a recent survey in the UK want action for nature, and 85% want action for climate. But that is not matched by an uptick in environmental behaviour. So there's this huge unanswered question, well, now answered, but this big question has been, well, how do we, you know, it's great that we can measure that the concern has gone up, but if that's not translating into changed behaviours and changed action, then what's going on? What have we been doing wrong? And what can we change to do better on that? And so here are some of the assumptions about what works. And mistaken assumptions about what works. So we've had this information deficit, and our approach has been to blizzard people with information and stats and graphs and scary stuff. It's very information issues based, and it is overwhelming, as I already said. It doesn't set people on a path towards action, and it can trigger aversive reactions. Then psychologists and others thought, oh, well, what we need to do is to connect communication with emotions. And this sort of understanding hasn't just happened in environment. This sort of thinking has happened in health and in other spheres as well, where people have wanted to shift behaviour or grow understanding, catalyse new behaviours. So, oh, we've got to connect, we've got to create an emotional response. But then, so first of all, it was the issues-based, described in ways that catalyse concern and worry and anxiety. But as I've said, that doesn't lead to deeper engagement, and it doesn't lead to action. And it's very weakly correlated with climate and nature positive behaviour. And apparently we've known this, or research world has known this since the 70s in relation to what affected environmental education have more widely on others. So then we ramped it all up a bit and we went to big fear appeals. But that is also very counterproductive because it can stimulate apathy and denial, or very high anxiety and depression and suicide. And I think we've got to really face this, people, that some of the way that we've been communicating is causing young people to commit suicide. And I was at an event just before COVID with a colleague who's on the call, and it was all about sort of what progress had been made around nature and environment in the last 25 years. And we asked some questions about the sort of human dynamic side and the psychological well-being side. And a participant came up, we were just participants, but a participant came up and collared us and said, my daughter is on the verge of committing suicide, and you said something that made me think I could find her some support and help. Please give me some advice. And my colleague, who's an environmental psychologist, did that and gave them some connections that he could get somebody to work with his daughter and counselling. He was that scared that he wouldn't even make it back that evening and his daughter would still be alive. So we've got to be really, really careful how we're communicating. If people are hearing these messages and feeling it's game over, and they are killing themselves as a result. Anyway, then some of us went to positive success stories, and I did that flip. So being hopeful and success stories and so on. And apparently that does inspire people for the short term, but they can also think, oh, good, somebody else is onto that. I don't need to worry. somebody else has sorted that. Oh, look, there's a good news story. So that's not really gaining the kind of traction either. I have to say, if you're on LinkedIn, connect with me, you will still see me sharing hopeful stories, because I think as a profession, we need to be as mindful of the good stuff as we are of the bad stuff. So then what does catalyze change? And there's been this assumption that beliefs drive action. And that's sort of part of, like, if you ramp up the information and the understanding, people will start having different attitudes and believe things differently, and that will catalyze action. And it turns out that's true, but not in really around nature and climate. And it's true when attitudes already are strong around the thing, that the actions feel very achievable and doable, and it's consistent with your self-view. But that's not characteristic of nature and climate. So that's really in the second category, that actions drive belief when attitudes are weak or uncertain. So there's really difficult choices to be made. Sometimes you're doing something that threatens your own identity or your self-image. Suddenly you're having to go a bit green, and you're being seen by colleagues around you as being a bit of a greenie. Or you're no longer driving your fast car, you're driving some small car or no car. And so these are difficult choices and difficult identities to sort of shift away from your identity. And so then it's taking action that drives your belief. And I'll explain how that works in a minute. So you start on a process of self-justification and self-persuasion. And that's what this looks like. So you decide to act, you're just going to take an action. Then you start justifying why you took that action. Then that strengthens your attitudes and your feelings about the action. Then your knowledge increases. And at that point, you start being more motivated to engage with climate and nature information. So your self-motivation, rather than it being used to persuade you and to care, you're finding it out, and you're finding out and expanding your understanding. And then that leads to more actions, and off you go in this sort of self-persuasive, virtuous cycle. So what then works? How does self-persuasion even work? And it works in very concrete and specific actions. So if somebody takes an action in one sphere, it doesn't necessarily mean they will in another. So again, I think there's been an assumption in the environmental world that if we could get people to, recycling, they'll suddenly start doing other environmental things. And the research shows that that's not what's happening. So if people take a load of, preemptively around the drought, people started taking water conservation measures, it doesn't automatically mean they're then going to start taking energy conservation measures. Or now people might start taking energy conservation measures because of the cost of energy. And so, but it doesn't, they're doing it for other reasons, and that's still great, they're doing it. But it doesn't mean they're suddenly going to go off and start taking a load of nature action. So the actions are in these sort of cycles of persuasion within that sort of sphere that you're already working in. So you might take water conservation in one aspect, and then you might start considering other ways you could conserve water. But you're not going to suddenly flip to another whole sphere and start acting in there unless you start taking an action. So what would cause you to take an action? And we'll come to that in a minute. And what comes to feel meaningful and doable to one person isn't automatically the same for others. So the same stories of change aren't going to work for everybody. But the key to self-persuasion is a sense of agency. And agency is when you know how to act. So it's a psychological phrase, but it's when you know how to act in order to bring about an intended effect. So it's not like you want to act on theory, but you know how to take that action. And there's individual agency, which is feeling it's in your gift to act. And then there's collective agency, where you feel you can take action with others and share and pool knowledge and skills for action. So now you've got a sense of agency. So then what creates agency? And that's social learning from the experiences and actions of others. So that's your learning in a social context. So it's not just sort of information coming at you that way, but you're learning about other people doing things. You believe you've got self-efficacy, so you believe you've got the ability to act, and you know how to act. And you know how to act in your context. So whether that's your personal, professional, or civic life, and your various roles and identities that you have, you know how to act in those contexts. So what then creates the social learning? And that's where we come to storytelling. So the key that we need to engage in our storytelling is to catalyze this thought: if they can do it, so can I. And stories can be about communities of place. You're telling stories of place and localized action. One community can be inspired by what's going on in another community. But there's also community of practice. So that's telling stories in your sphere, whether you're in the NHS or you're a scientist or an architect or a banking world or whatever. What are the stories in those spheres? What are people doing in those spheres and telling those stories? So the principles of this storytelling is that the primary purpose is to encourage people to act. So it's not this primary purpose we've all been having, which is to raise concern and raise awareness and trigger fear or positivity or whatever things we've been trying to do. Your primary purpose is to encourage others to act and to take their very first step in self-persuasion, to develop their own agency, and then they investigate further and go up that virtuous cycle I just showed you. So that's about creating stories about relatable people or groups solving a specific challenge with a storyline that's informed by reliable, reputable information. This is where sort of good, solid information needs to come in. Obviously, those of you who work around this, there's sort of ways of writing, which are around the active voice, good reading, ease, everyday language. If anybody wants any note on that, we actually have a note because we sometimes train scientists in this, in how to write in this more accessible way. And there the story needs to be entertaining or engaging with some sort of element of surprise in it. So then how do you even find your stories? So you can obviously create a story character, and some of you are going to have some fun playing around with that in the later part of the morning. Or you can find the story character. But whoever this character or characters, if it's a group or a community or a group of practice, it's got to be relatable to the people that you're trying to communicate with. So if it's sort of about a family making change to influence other families, or if it's trying to, I don't know, influence farmers, then it's got to be a farmer that's making the change. So it can be fictional or real. For true stories, apparently, the way to find this is the positive outlier. And the positive outlier is the person or group within a community that is already doing things differently. So wherever there's a challenge, people will go ahead. There will be some people, those of us who are sort of pioneering, the pioneers of the pioneers, if you like, and we're out ahead, and I identify with this. We're out ahead and we're trying to find new things and do things in new ways and find what works and do that more and better and quicker and then tell other people about it. So you find those kind of people. Who are those, what are called the positive outlines? Or I think they're called the positive deviants, which in the technical language, which sounds a really rather worrying phrase. But anyway, let's just stick with positive outliers. So they're within the group, but they're just at the edge of it. And you find those people and then you tell their story for their group. And you create this, this relatable storyline. And this is a simplification of the narrative pattern. So you start from wherever they're at, wherever your character or characters are at. Then you start describing the goals that they went towards and how they reflected on that. And then they went somewhere further, and then they went somewhere further. And then what success looked like. They reached their goals. There was celebration. And so that's more or less the narrative pattern. And then within that, you're doing various other things. So you need to describe the character, so that you're making them very relatable, and their context that they're operating from. Then you have to show how they took action and set out from the known. This iterative goal setting, what they first went for, how that worked, what challenges they overcame. So one goal, showing the progress, one goal at a time, and in a context of both who they're getting support from, who's opposing them, what challenges are they overcoming practically or technically, how are they pioneering, what are they innovating. And then you show them modelling the desired changes through their actions and describe them enjoying the benefits. So Kris tells a story, I presume, of a real person in the West Country who was an older woman, a retired woman, and she had her heating broke down and it was very expensive. And she decided she wanted to have a heat pump in her home. But she didn't really know anything about it. She didn't know about the technology. She just heard about them. So she started taking action, which was to find some information about a heat pump. Then she acted to get the heat pump put in and all the challenge she had to do that. And then the story ends with the celebration of the fact that she sort of living in warmth at very low cost for the rest of her life and feeling very secure around her heating. And I bet she's feeling even more secure now compared to the rest of us. But that story got loads of traction in media in the Southwest. Then it got picked up, I think, by ITV, and the story was in the news nationally. And the key thing is that then the uptick in people going for heat pumps increased. Anybody who saw this story thought, well, if she can do it, so can I. So that was the key catalyst to that story. And I'm not going to go into all of this slide, but how is storytelling affecting us? And I'm just going to pick up on two things. So on the left-hand side, there's this thing called neural coupling, which means that a story, if you hear a story and it's a relatable character, it activates for you, it resonates for you, your feelings and your ideas and your experience. So you start sort of coupling with the story you're hearing. And then it also, ideally, if it's a great story, it gives you a release of dopamine. And then so there's some sort of emotional connection to the story, and then that will make it much easier to remember, and it will sort of embed with greater accuracy. And I won't worry with the other two things. So this is the key, and I can't say this enough. The story is trying to trigger this thought. If they can do it, so can I. So that is what our stories would need to aim at. But hey, a lot of us are environmentalists. We're not storytellers. That's not been the way we've communicated with others. So what can we do? Well, we need to go up our virtuous self-persuasion journey on storytelling. So we need to start by taking actions and get onto that spiral, taking actions around being storytellers. And there's the opportunity for that later this morning. Using all forms. So whatever form you're used to, I know there's some people who do videography on the call. I know there are some people who write. But, you know, whatever your form is that you write in, fiction, non-fiction, spoken, song, film, whatever it is, then we're telling stories of the characters and what they're doing, and that we need to do that in absolutely every walk of life. So we need to get it right across banking, education, science, I don't know, health, whatever sphere of life there is, we need to be telling those stories, and it not just being stories of people who use and engage with the environment, so a recreation person or a fisher or a farmer or an environmentalist, but actually what are these other spheres and sectors doing? Where are the stories there of people taking these pro-environmental choices and actions? And even policy outputs can be action-based, not issues-based. So we need to transform what we do from this conventional issues-based approach that we've had for decades, where there's been a poverty of inspirational stories, and move to a future approach where we've got a myriad of action-based stories. We've had widespread lack of agency. We need to tell these stories to encourage agency and the self-persuasion, and that if they can do it, so can I thinking. And we need to way broaden out what we conceptualize as pro-environmental, way beyond just what we consume or our activism, to myriad ways to act, and providing a myriad of opportunities for people to take their first action. And then this is a vision. It started, Kris has it in his paper. I've sort of amended it a little bit. So just imagine it is 2030 and everybody you know is taking climate and nature action, because we all keep inspiring each other with these stories of how we overcome challenges. We discover and share new ways of doing things. We celebrate and share our successes. And as a result, nature is recovering. We're limiting and adapting to the climate changes that is already locked in, and we're overcoming our environmental injustices. So there we go. I'm sorry that I'm not Kris, but I hope I did a good job at trying to present his ideas and work. And I will try and take a couple of questions here, though I'm not the one who's all knowledgeable about this. So.
Great, thank you, Diana. We only have time for maybe one or two questions, so if you do have any, please put them in chat. We did have one sort of question or comment, which was, surely the action and belief system also works for actions that are not likely to help nature climate crisis, cementing a different belief. So I don't know if you've got any comment on that, Diana.
Well, certainly in his paper, he alludes to, Kris De Meyer alludes to that, of course, the self-persuasion is a double-edged sword. I mean, you could self-persuade yourself into drug addiction, you can self-persuade yourself into obesity, you can self-persuade yourself into all sorts of nefarious and unhelpful things. And of course, likewise, you could self-persuade yourself into driving the fastest, most gas-guzzling car you could find, or that it's fine to solo flight. So absolutely, of course, it is a double-edged sword, but we need to be telling those stories that inspire the environment and nature response.
Great, thank you, Diana. So another comment or question here, which was, I understand the reasons not to resort to doomism. However, difficult to work on climate and nature issues without acknowledging the seriousness of the situation. Are there audiences or situations where we would consider the stark messages as more appropriate?
I knew this question would come up, and I was going to ask it if Kris was here. So I've thought a little bit about it, and so I just offer you this with where I thought, which is that if this is about, if that doesn't work to catalyse behaviour change, when is it necessary? When is it doing a job? When is the communication worth doing? And I think it must be when we're talking to each other. So as a professional environmentalist. So 2 years ago, we did a piece of work which was helping global experts in climate change, both the ecological, physical, economic and social impacts of climate change. These are global experts coming together to ask, shockingly, for the first time in this workshop that we ran across a week. And absolutely they need to be telling. They were sharing knowledge that hadn't even got into the IPCC report. And I came out of each of those days really struggling. Because of course you take an emotional hit being on the front line of so many difficult stories, and we are, as a Dialogue Matters is always on the front line of change. So it was hard, and they did absolutely have to be sharing their stats, their knowledge, their insights, because they were looking about what the priorities to change the global economic models, which have been deeply flawed and do wrongly influence or mislead global leaders. So that was their priority work, and they did, after that workshop, they fast-tracked a couple of things, and it did go on to influence the Biden administration. People might remember just before COP26, they had quite a significant shift in what they were doing, and that's partly from some of the scientists in our workshop coming together and developing their thinking, and it also influenced the UK's negotiating position in COP26. So that's absolutely the right place where we've got to be having those kind of discussions. But if we're trying to mobilise action in other sectors, in other communities, with other groups, then trying to frighten them into it doesn't work, so why do it? That's where I've got to all my thinking.
Thanks, Diana. If you could keep them fairly quick answers, I'm going to ask a couple more, and then we need to move on, just because we're against time.
Okay.
How can we work together to link this into making the conservation more inclusive? Thinking about EDI. Well,
then I think we did last year. We did some work around what are the barriers and solutions for Black people and people of colour to enter and progress in the environment sector, because it is shockingly and disgustingly the whitest profession in the UK outside of farming. And so there are some truly inspirational people, Black people and people of colour, working around environment, needing support, and it would be fantastic to tell their stories and have photographs where, like even trying to find photographs of my presentations today, you know, I had to actively look for ones that weren't all just white people. So, you know, just our images, our stories need to be inclusive. Yeah, absolutely.
Great, thank you. Let me just have a look here. I'd encourage everyone, we're not going to have a chance to go through everything, but I'd encourage everyone on the call to have a quick read of the chat, because there's some really interesting comments being put up there.
Shall I also just say that we will put a link, I'm sorry I didn't have this ready, but as you understand, trying to get Kris's paper into a presentation has rather meant some of the details for today didn't happen. But we will get you the link to his paper afterwards so that you can read it. I have to say it's one of the most readable academic papers I've ever read in my life. It's a good one, so we'll get that to you all as well.
There's a question here around, is it important that people feel it is actually affecting them, because maybe most people in the UK don't feel the impact yet?
Well, I think it's these, so from what I've understood, it's about that they've got to act before they feel. So you just take an action. So you just start taking an action, and then you start thinking, oh, why did I take that action? And then you self-justify and you go up the spiral.
Can I jump in on this one, please?
Oh, yes, please, Livvy,
Sorry,
if you've got an answer, that's
I've
fabulous.
listened to his talk before, and I use some of his content in my slides. So I would say the thing is about people in this country is the stories we should be telling are about people in this country taking action to address the issue. And what he says is we don't have to stop talking about the issue. What we do is we use the people taking the action to talk about the issue. So we're switching it round. So we're still able to talk about the problem, and we're saying people are taking this action to address this problem. So what we need to do is use relatable people in this country. And one of his points about there's an organization who've got loads of positive pictures, but they're all of people in, I think, climate outreach. They're all in the global south. They're not pictures of people in this country. So we need to be using relatable messengers. And that's something I'm going to talk about. The relatable messengers people relate to. So that's how we do it.
Brilliant. Thanks, Livvy.
Thanks, Livvy.
And just to say that the audience is not, the people, I don't even want to think of as an audience who are all in this together, but the people here aren't all from the UK. So we've got people from Australia, we've got people from Greece, I think, we've got people from many different countries on joining us today. Maybe if you want to put I'm from whatever country that's not the UK, we'll get a sense of where everybody's from, which would be lovely, but I know it's not just UK. So if we're sounding a bit UK centric, I think some of what we're talking about translates to many other countries and contexts as well.
Great, thank you, Diana. It's time for us to move on to the next talk. Thank you for jumping in there, Livvy. So Livvy will be giving the next talk. Livvy's the founder of Sustainable Sidekicks, which is a sustainable consultant and behaviour change specialist. Livvy uses her insights from behavioural science to help environmental change makers to achieve their sustainable goals. So over to you, Livvy.
Okay, so favourite question, can you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Great, and you can hear me? Yes. We're winning. We're on to a winner. So it's great to be able to talk to you. I took out loads of my slides, which are from Kris De Meyer, and I really advocate his approach. And what I'm going to talk about will complement that, obviously, and some of the things that Diana's spoken about. I'm going to talk a bit more about behavioural science and about action and what inspires action. So what I'm going to do is talk a bit about some of the behavioural drivers and then how we as change makers can activate them. And I've got examples from around the world. So let's quickly, I'm going to do an intro. We're going to talk about education versus behaviour change, what drives behaviours, 3 different types of elements, how we include those in our communications. And as mentioned, you'll get these slides. So my story, my hero story, I was having a great time being an event manager, and I was working in Australia, and I went to a full solar eclipse festival in far north Queensland, and I'd just seen the Great Barrier Reef and was a bit blown away. And then I saw a full solar eclipse and I was like, wow, nature's incredible. What am I doing to support her? When I was growing up, I was really passionate about saving animals and recycling and life. I mean, I still did my recycling, I still cared about it, but I thought, I'm this enthusiastic person, why am I giving this to this industry that's so wasteful? And I came back to the UK and I did another 9 months of really soul destroying corporate events job, and then that was it. I thought, right, that's it, I'm going into sustainable events, because I thought I was going to save the rainforest. And then I realized I knew nothing about rainforests. So I got into sustainable events, and then I had another light bulb moment when we brought in a consultant who talked about behavior change, and I had this other aha moment. And with all due respect to people on the call, I suddenly realized this is why Greenpeace and Friends of the Earth haven't inspired more people. Like, I care about the things that they talk about, but why don't others? And this is what I learned. So I work on plastics campaigns with organizations, businesses. I still do some stuff in events, applying behavior change to sustainability issues. And I'm going to talk about some behavior change now. So this is my theory of change. We need to know what's driving the existing behavior. We need to see what structural changes we can make. How can we make it socially acceptable? And then we start communicating positively in the way that Kris had outlined. And why do we need to go beyond education to drive behavior change? So as Diana said, education doesn't change or drive action. And when we say, oh, people just need educating, this is called the information deficit model. All we're doing is raising awareness. And in conservation examples, it's been shown that this doesn't change behavior. So I just remembered I didn't put my timer on. Actually, I can see it from here. In Uganda, they did loads of work on conflict resolution, education, community resource access, support for community development, but poaching and illegal grazing continued. And the researchers concluded that attitudes and awareness are not adequate predictors of conservation behavior. And in the case of the wildlife trade in Asia, researchers concluded that the link between information provision and behavior change is tenuous at best. So what is the difference between an education campaign and a behavior change campaign? So the education approach, this comes from Katie Patrick's book. And the example of education is putting up a poster, organizing a talk, sending an email. So you guys all coming along to this, we're only raising your awareness. We're not changing your behaviors as yet. What a behavioral approach would do is give everyone a water bottle if they don't already have them, because there's enough water bottles in the world. Ask people to write a pledge. Put all the pledges on the wall so they're visible. Use smiley faces to acknowledge people using their water bottle. And we'll talk about why these things work versus just education. So what drives behaviors if it's not a lack of awareness or knowledge? So the psychological influences. So first up, behavioral economics introduces psychology to economy theory to understand decision making. And it highlights the lack of rationality in us humans. And they've got this huge list of biases that inform what we do in certain situations. And biases or heuristics are shortcuts that we make. And you can look up hundreds of them here. And what they've done is looked at the brain, and they've identified that, well, psychologists have, and neuroscientists, that we've got these three different parts. Obviously the brain is complex, but we've got the lizard part, which is a really old part. Then we've got the mammal part, which is similar to mammals, been around for a while. And then we've got our human brain, which is much newer. So which part do we think drives the show? Well, turns out that quite often it's actually these older brain parts, our lizard and our mammal brain, that kick in way before our human brain. And I use the example, storytelling. I was mugged in London very long time ago, 20 years ago. And after that, and my instinct was to run when this guy got too close to me. And I ignored my instinct because I thought he would think it was weird. And then I got mugged. Then every time I was walking down a street, specifically in London, suddenly I would get fight or flight mode, and I'd wonder why. And my mammal or my mammal brain had kicked in, and it was going into saving me. My human brain hadn't even clocked that there was a man walking down the road. So we shouldn't underestimate how powerful these other parts of our brain are. And there's an issue with our human brain as well. It's like a very inefficient car. It uses a lot of energy, and it uses energy for us to make decisions, to process complexity, to make change. And this is what has been simplified as our system 2 part of the brain. And this is what we use for problem solving. And we use it much less when we're tired. And so Daniel Kahneman, he talks about the system 1 and the system 2 brain. So the system 2 brain is this very slow, deliberate and logical part, the rational brain. And our brain is actually more like, the other part of our brain is more like an economic car. This is the energy efficient option, and it is trying to save energy. So it uses memories and context, like what happened last time I did that? Probably do it again. How did I get to work? What did I do the last time I left the office? What did I do the last time I visited a nature reserve with my rubbish? And it uses emotions. So what makes us feel good? So we're very emotionally driven, and it looks for those shortcuts and the easy option. And it also does something where it actually filters out all the information because we can't process everything that comes into our brain. So it filters out things that are perceived to be irrelevant. And I use the example, again, a story, of when I was dating someone who had a red car. And I'd see these red cars suddenly always, hadn't noticed them before, stopped dating him, stopped seeing the red cars. Why? Because my brain was like, red cars aren't important to you, my lady. Think about bicycles, probably a better bet. So what our brain does is, if we're talking about things like climate, like nature, crises, and actually it's not relevant to those audiences, they're not going to see it. And we need to think about this if we're trying to address behaviours in our parks or in our spaces. So what we can do instead is use icons. And this is because we process images much faster than we do text. So in a study, students actually achieved a test result of 89% with image instructions versus 40% with text only. So thinking about using, if you've got your, if you're thinking about bins, I'm going to use bins a lot because they're an easy example, colourful bins and icons, better than text. And icons of the items people are holding in their hand, not a dustbin saying general waste. We can also make sure things are salient. So what is salience? This is because our brains are drawn to things that are moving, out of place. And we're more likely, weirdly, to pay a fine if it's personalized. So we respond to personalized things. We're more likely to open a letter that is handwritten, which is why lots of charities do those handwritten letters. So how can we present information in a novel way? And this goes back to our survival mode. We're always looking for things that are out of place and unexpected. And these bins that you can see here were used in Bournemouth, and they got a much greater, they decreased littering versus the same plain black bins, versus some signs that the council thought would be a good idea that said sort your S.T out. Those ones actually increased littering, and I'll tell you why later. These ones, fun bins, feed my face. These were compost bins in Bristol, and they asked people to put stickers on their bins and of faces. They didn't talk about composting, just stickers, and it increased composting. So I'm not going to talk through these, but when you get these slides, these are some ways for you to feedback and think about what you, how you could apply these principles to your campaigns. So another thing that we have to struggle with is effort versus benefit. So our brain is thinking, how difficult is that? And 2/3 of that effort is actually in our head. So we perceive things to be harder than they are. So cycling versus driving, looking for a rubbish bin. Time is also a signal of how difficult something is. And if it takes a long time, it's seen to be more difficult. So think about washable nappies versus disposable. Language is also an indicator of time, of effort. So if we use toxic words such as have to, must, and should, that sounds like it's difficult. But we can use feel-good words like easy and quick. And our brains also, or a lot of us, will think, what's in it for me? And if there's no perceived benefit, then people can be less likely to take action. So how can we communicate a win-win? It's good for the planet, it's good for nature, and it's good for us, rather than just this altruistic reason, oh, it's good for the planet. So we can talk about health, family, well-being, local community. Another thing our good old mammal pre-reptilian brain is very good at is short-term thinking. And it makes sense. We needed to survive. So we're wired for short-term goals and climate, and not climate change. So we have this thing called temporal discounting, where we put more value on what is available right now, rather than a more distant and future goal going into the future. And I'll explain a bit more about a test that was done. So people get motivated, demotivated if it's a big goal and they don't see reaction immediately. So people are evolutionarily wired for immediate threats. And with COVID-19, yes, it was invisible, but it was immediate, in the now. Climate chaos is invisible and it's always been in the future. Ice caps melting and polar bears are not relatable because they're happening over there to other people or other creatures. Whereas when we started talking about 12 years in the IPCC report, suddenly it became something in the here and now. So that's from George Marshall's book. So there's a good case study which suggests something else that we need to think about. So people were given money and a choice of public investment schemes. They could invest in a scheme that was good, was cheap in the present, had no negative consequences, but presented damage in the future. And then there was another scheme that would cost more in the present, but had no negative consequences for future generations. Almost everyone chose the short-term scheme. Then they changed it around and they asked people to make a self-commitment nudge. I will not put the interests of my own group above the interests of future generations. And this self-commitment nudge nudged people to be more committed to the long-term scheme. So this is called a commitment. It plays into commitment bias. And public commitments have been used successfully in conservation. So humans have a bias to having a positive, consistent positive image. So if we say something, we want to live up to it. And so in the North Republic of Congo, they used intergroup monitoring schemes and systems, and this decreased wildlife hunting more than intergroup communication alone. So if people thought they were being watched, they behaved differently. And that also plays in something called observation bias. And in the Netherlands, they found that farmers who did a public commitment reported to be more likely to adopt sustainable farming than those who just got feedback. So commitments do make a difference. So we can also do something to address this short-term thinking, and it's called feedback loops. So I'm going to give some examples that aren't nature-based. Energy monitoring equipment. This gives an instant feedback to how much energy has been used. Weekly emails. These sustained energy saving behaviour with students over a 3-month period after the intervention. Handwritten notes. These sustained behaviours longer than money did. And financial benefits don't drive change. Social acknowledgement does better. And we can think of things like badges of honour, which are visual, like emails, award ceremonies, and unexpected prizes. And some examples of supporter feedback loops. You can see the one on the left is from the blood donations. So thank you for your blood donation. And then your donation has been issued to Gloucester Royal Hospital. So this is two feedback loops of saying thank you and what's happening. So that will encourage someone to do it again. And then the other example here I've got is from when I bought a train in Spain. It tells me how much energy, carbon emissions I've saved. So again, some things for you to reflect on. So that's one element, is psychology. But infrastructure, this is a big area. And if you are looking at, you've got control over a space, then this might be something to think about. And this goes beyond the idea of just nudging and poking people. And this is more like kind of systemic change. And this is kind of the thing that I'm most interested in. So how do infrastructures and layout influence behavior? Something called the choice architecture describes how the decisions we make are affected by the layout, the sequencing, and the range of choices that are available. And people will generally choose the easy option or the most familiar. So we are choice architects if we have control over a space, and so we need to make sure that the default option is the eco one. So if you've got a cafe, remove those disposable cups and just put reusable ones there, or make that the default and they have to ask for the single-use one. And this choice architecture has been done and defaults with reducing meat use content and consumption. So making sausages smaller, reduce 20% of meat. People still got the meat. Putting vegetarian sausages next to the meat led to a 50% increase, and this is in the Netherlands. Improving the visual presentation of vegan and veggie options on a buffet. And doubling the proportion of vegetarian meals offered increased vegetarian sales by between 40 and 79%. So menus with 2 in 4 options increased the consumption of vegan food. And at the BET conference, they made the default choice vegetarian on the menu. So people had to change it for it to be meat. And in wildlife campaigns, there's a lot that's done with changing the infrastructure. So sending people seeds, wildlife corridors, working with landowners on rewilding campaigns, like what Norfolk Rewilding are doing, bringing back bison. Litter-free Dorset has worked with shops to remove the disposable barbecues to address wildfires. And Refill is a scheme which makes it as easy to get your bottle refilled in a cafe where you could buy bottled water. So this is all about us changing the choice architecture that's available to people. So again, a bit of a thought there, which you can do at another time. So if someone can give me a 5-minute warning, because I think I actually started my slides before we got started. So moving on to our social influences. So social influences are the third of the thing that I want to consider, and these are really important. And this goes back to what Kris was talking about. And with our behaviours, we have things around us called social norms, and these are what prescribe what people should and shouldn't do. And injunctive norms are what society expects us to do. Descriptive norms are what others around us are doing, and people will look for other people to inform their behaviours. So how this has been used for good. So just to say, in areas where there's lots of littering on the floor, people will start littering because they think it's a social norm because they can see the litter. In China, they boosted farmers' enrollment in a grain-to-grain program when they told people that their neighbours were getting involved. So by using that idea of what your neighbours are doing, keeping up with the Joneses really works. And it's been shown to work in other circumstances. So we look for this social proof, and we're more influenced by people who look like us, which is why we need to be talking about people in our own country being affected by climate change or taking action on climate change. And social contagion has happened where people see solar panels on the walls, with their neighbours. So 1/3 of customers of Solar City actually bought them because their friends or neighbours had got them on their roof, because they're very visual. So social contagion and social proof is really important if we want to drive behaviour change. It's also really important for our communications. So my last slides are on communications. And so I'm assuming I'm doing okay on time. I'm not sure there's anything gone in the chat. So if we use this kind of social proof, it's not a good thing. So if we say 70% of people don't recycle, that's saying that not recycling is the norm. If we say 1 out of 10 people litter, this increased littering. So talking about the behaviour we don't want to do is a no-no. What we need to do is describe what people are doing. So saying be a hero, recycle, and 9 out of 10 people use a bin reduced littering. Thanks, Ross. And again, with nature signs, this sign here, please don't remove the petrified wood from the park. This led to 1.67 bits of wood being stolen in the petrified forest in America. Many past visitors have removed the petrified wood, more got stolen. So they're saying that everyone else is doing it, so people are going to do it. So we want to avoid that. We need to talk about the behaviour we want people to do. We can also think about our messengers. And again, this is coming back to what Kris said. So non-relatable messengers. So Bird Girl spoke to Avon Wildlife Trust and said the lack of people of colour in their communications meant people didn't think their reserves for them, they were just for white people. So they made a change. Messengers that are relatable are important, or authority figures. So managers, trusted brands, weirdly supermarkets. People who look like us are important. So Sabrina McCormack in her research found that People responded more positively if they were everyday people taking action rather than famous people. And in this Edelman Trust thing, we can see here that my co-workers feature nearly as trusted as scientists. And another thing that we need to be considerate of is activating loss. So if we talk about giving things up, this is painful to our brain. So if we talk about not flying, it actually means that people experience FOMO, so that a loss experienced twice as much. But we can do this for good. We can use this to encourage people to bring a reusable cup, for instance. The latte levee works because people are being charged and they don't want to pay for the disposable cup. So we can use financial savings of what people are going to lose rather than what they're going to save. And this has a better outcome. I'm going to, have I got enough time to talk about scarcity? Probably not. I think we're probably out of time, aren't we? So there's some slides on scarcity here. And as Kris talked, we need to talk about abundance. We need to talk about how many people are taking action. So I think that's all been covered now. And finally, just as I end this, I've covered a lot of things in a very short space of time. It's taken me a day to get this down to so little. But what you need to remember from all that I've shared is EAST. How do we make things easy, attractive, social, and timely when we think of behaviours? And this is a behavioural insights term. And you will be going to do an exercise later on where you can explore this. And so the things that I've talked about kind of fit into these categories. And this is sort of like your sense check when you come back to finishing something off. Like, have we made this sound easy? Is it attractive? I do longer workshops. I do ones on other things. I also support change makers to adopt behaviour change in their campaigns. And there's the links there. I'm not sure whether we have time for questions, but let's see what Joel has to say.
Yeah, great. Thank you for that, Livvy. We do have time for maybe just one or two questions. So I'm just going to pick them out at random from chat, but again, I'd encourage everyone to have a little read through the chat, because again, there's been some really interesting conversations going on while that talk was happening. So someone said, I can see this working on a small community scale, but how do we do this on a large scale to influence government policy, both in the UK and globally?
So the challenge we have with policy as a way of changing behaviour and trying to change the government is that they take the behavioural economics approach of like nudge theory, and they just want to poke and change but keep people with things. What we need to be pushing the governments to do is infrastructure change, so that people don't have to make a decision. So what we're talking about here is how do we drive change on an infrastructure level. So behaviour change, so policy would be sort of a different angle of changing behaviours. And what policy can do is policy can change social norms. So when smoking became illegal inside, what it did was make smoking less socially attractive. So that's the thing. So when we think about when you think about the behavior you're trying to change, what you would need to do is do what I said first of all, is understand what's driving the behavior. So look at that and then think about what is that you're looking to address. And is it that you have to go for government to change the policy? Is there another way that you could change the choice architecture? Is it actually that you should be working with individuals, landowners, businesses that are creating the things that are driving the behavior? So rather than think about policy, I think we need to think about what's the behavior and how we drive change. The COM-B model looks more at using policy as a tool.
Great, thank you, Livvy. So another one here, which was, is there research around sort of different audiences, and if there's different barriers to engagement or opportunity for action with different audiences?
Yes, completely. And when you're looking to drive behaviors, you need to segment your audiences, and you need to research to understand what's driving those behaviors, and what are the barriers and what are the motivators. And I break my talks down. I've got 3, and one covers audiences. So this was just about behavior change theory, but very much we can't apply and assume that the same barriers are, or the same motivators are for audiences. So that's the really important thing, is we have to do the research first of all to understand what's going on, rather than thinking, hey, we'll just do some gamification, or hey, we'll just do some social norming. We need to see try things out.
Great, thanks. And I guess kind of linked with that, is this a Western ideology interpretation?
Well, what does that mean?
I guess I understood the question to mean, so a lot of what you presented in your talk, Livvy, is it more focused for a Western audience and the way our brains work as a Western audience versus other audiences around the world?
No, well, so this is based on behavioral science, which is based on psychology. So the psychological drivers are kind of similar across the world, but again, what you need to be doing with any of these interventions is, or what you're looking to do train, is understand what is driving the behavior. So is it a habit? Is it something that people do because of, scarcity? Is it because it's what their neighbors do? And I think, there's a good paper that I've linked to in there. It's by BIT, which is the Behavioral Insights team. And they've used examples from around the world. So where they've worked with tribes in Africa around illegal logging and all these things. So this is about psychology and what sort of makes people tick. But equally, you need to look at each individual audience and understand and find out what is driving that behavior. Is it what their neighbors do? Is it the habits? Is it the infrastructure that's leading them to that? So it's not about a way of, so I think what we need to do is kind of, do the research to understand what is going on, and then develop the behavior change interventions based on that.
Great, thank you very much for that, Livvy. Right, we don't have any time for any more questions, but thanks again, Livvy, for that really interesting talk. We're just going to head into a break now for 15 minutes. So if you could all be back for 11:50, we will then be going into our next talk.
So we're just going to actually hear from some people who are trying to set up something called AVoice, which is about trying to tell these stories about nature, climate, and societal justice. And I will hand over to them in a minute, but I just want to say a little something first for the interest of openness and transparency. So we've been trying to get an online magazine, catalyze an online magazine for about 5 years. And we've worked, various people have got really excited about this idea and come close to us, and we've tried to make things happen. Had lots of meetings and then it's not happened. And then we tried again and it's not happened. So it was at one point going to be called Game Changers, and then it was going to be called Change Makers, and now it might be called AVoice. So we're just trying it again, but even more compelled by the idea that getting out these stories really makes a difference at all different parts of society, different parts of geography, and different stories. So we're just trying again at the moment, and we're doing this event very far from profit, but the little bit extra that I'm just giving my time pro bono, but the extra bit that we've made that would otherwise have covered my time is going to AVoice. But in the interest of transparency, I just want to acknowledge that Isaac is indeed my son. He's a journalist by training and has done some really fascinating work for Black Lives Matter and other sort of purpose-driven communications. And so he and Chiara are just going to tell you a little bit about where they've got to, and would like to hear your stories, and would ask for help if anybody can give it. So Isaac, over to you and Chiara.
Hi, hello everyone. Thank you for the opportunity to have this space. I will start just a quick introduction of who I am, then Isaac will do the same, and then we'll start introducing the idea. My background is I worked alongside, and I was privileged to do that, alongside human rights defenders and activists as an advocate, peace building and communication professional in developing countries for a few years. So I worked in Ecuador, Colombia, South Africa, Nepal, so that was amazing. Then I saw the link between human and environmental rights. And so I embarked on a master in conservation science and policy. And given the experience in communication, then I sort of approached a community radio, which is, you know, I would advise anyone to do, and presented an environmental show for a few years, and currently collaborating with the Community Media Forum Europe on another project on religious hate speech, both aiming at creative alternative narratives to the mainstream. So that's when I'm happy. I am happy when I can provide people and issues with a platform, especially those voices that are least represented. And I agree, you know, in the chat, for example, it was mentioned a few times of, you know, how we tend to have a Western view. And, you know, that's why I'm very passionate about representing views that are not Western as well. And I strongly believe in community media as well as a way to develop communities, whether they're a community of interest or community of space, and to come. And I think that audio is quite democratic tool to do that. So that's from my part. Now Isaac will carry on introduce himself. Maybe.
Just so you're aware, Isaac, you're currently muted.
Sorry. Sorry about that. Thank you, Chiara. And yes, my name is Isaac. As Diana said, I'm a trained journalist, and I also have a few years experience working with digital media and online platforms. I've worked as editor and then editor-in-chief of an online project dedicated to showcasing social enterprise entrepreneurs. But I've also written for the Daily Mirror and some other established news outlets. While I was at the Mirror, Extinction Rebellion first took to the streets of London, and I was actually responsible for one of their first interviews with their co-founder, Dr. Helena Bradbrook, and even ended up getting some coverage of XR into an electronic music magazine. So I have a fair bit of experience of getting different types of stories into sort of unexpected places. But generally what I've found, and I'm sure many of you here are aware, you wouldn't be here otherwise, what I found is that the way journalists talk about climate change, and quite often the environment in general, tends to alienate people. The people reading or watching end up seeing our natural world as something sort of separate from ourselves, and you can see it on the BBC or news channels in general when they talk about the latest natural disaster or the countryside or the ice caps melting. It's either insurmountable, trivial, or so far away it's sort of hard to feel that it's real. But when you see or read something about the economy, say, or the rising utility bills that's going on, you often get an interview with a person talking about the larger story and how it affects them, and occasionally it will go into sort of what can be done about it. So it's not like journalists don't know how to write stories that sort of convey information but focus on the human element. But then even still, these stories tend to fall short of what we're sort of all here talking about today. And so with the platform AVoice, Chiara and I are hoping to take it one step further, and the human element would then become sort of bringing a focus onto people's journeys, what they've achieved on those journeys, while still conveying the information that people need to know about nature and climate change. Back to you, Chiara.
Let's unmute myself, give myself a voice. So following what Isaac was saying, and this might sound a bit of a cliche, but we do believe that a voice has a power to change the world, you know, and if you think, you know, imagine you put a voice plus a voice plus a voice, and then you create sort of a ripple effect. And Diana called them the positive outliers. But, you know, these are maybe the stories that we're going to start to collect. I think of a Tower of Babel, and then you bring stories of people, communities who have taken actually actions, and they're contributing through their actions to a sustainable and, you know, equitable world, ideally. So this platform means to inspire others to act, because if you hear people who actually look, well, if you hear they sound like you and maybe they look like you, then, as we said, they've done it, so you can do it because they're similar to you. So you get inspired to take actions. And the way that we want to do it, initially, it's likely to be by facilitating a collage of voices. So through interviewing people directly. And then what we want to do, though, is encourage them to interview others and, and to act, to reach out, and themselves become enablers of other voices to come through, and to build their voices, to build their skills. And we would like to also support and train them when necessary, so that they can actually go, and it becomes a movement of people actually go on and on. And we want anyone who is in this space, in this room today, to actually be a part of this in any way that you possibly can. So Isaac is going to put like a simple basic form that you can all fill in if you're interested, where you can comment, you can say, oh, actually, I think this is a great idea. I know someone else who actually might be interested in knowing more, or actually give me a call. I would love to speak about this a bit more and tell you, I'm doing actually something that is relevant. How can we talk together and collaborate? And also, support us in trying to find finance for this, because obviously without money, unfortunately, we can't go anywhere. Anything that is legal ideally works, so we're not going to go and rob a bank, not quite yet anyway. So anything that you think can help us, that would be great. And also any feedback, ideas you might have, any questions also, we are kind of here to answer that.
Thanks ever so much, you two. Before we go on, there was just a question that somebody had obviously Googled, and there's something called Voice Mag. Did you say it was called Voice? And they've got a link and they put that in chat, but that's not, that you haven't already set that up, have you? No. And it's AVoice as one word. Yeah.
Yeah, AVoice, all one word. But yes, we haven't got the website set up yet. So whatever you find, it's not us.
Okay, brilliant. Joel, back to you. Is it, or to Ross?
Sure. So are we, is it Q&A now, or are we on to the next talk?
I think we're on to the next talk with time. But if you've got questions for Chiara or Isaac, then pop them in chat, and please, is that a form, Isaac, that I see there?
Yes, yeah, it's
Inviting,
just a standard
okay.
Google form thing that you can fill out, put your details in, questions, tips, advice, information, whatever you like.
Okay. Any support you can offer. Brilliant. Stories, funds, techie support. I don't know. Okay, Joel, back to you, and then on to Charlie.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Diana. So moving on to our next talk now, which is going to be given by Charly Cox, who is a professional facilitator who recently co-wrote the first book on climate change coaching, founder of Climate Change Coaches. Charly has many years' experience helping to motivate people to overcome powerlessness and embrace change. So over to you, Charly.
Thanks, Joel. So it's nice to be with you all this morning. I'm sorry not to have been able to join you sooner. Can I ask, before I start, can you tell me who you are, in the sense of your name and what you do, and also what you might want to get out of the session that I'm about to lead here. So I'm going to be talking to you about how to use a connection first or a relationship first approach to galvanizing action on climate. And it would be great to know what you would really love to take away from that. So who you are, what you do, so I can get a sense of who's in the room and what you'd like to take away from this session. If you can just throw that in the chat, that'd be great. Great. Thanks, Helen. Great. So there's some people interested about coaching as an approach. There's some people interested in using it in behavior change. Abby, a nature communication, conservation communicator in Ireland. God, that sounds so fascinating. Laura, Bristol City Council. We work with Oxford City Council, so I have some rough guess at what might be going on for you guys, and you are leading the way there. Sustainability advisor, environmental manager. Great. This is what I was expecting. This is great. Okay. I'm a coach working with, it's Kath. Hi, Kath. Kath has done our training course. Brilliant. Okay. Brilliant. Gosh, there's some really specialist, skilled people in this room. I'm delighted that you're here, because I'm hoping to learn as much from you, if not more from you, than you're going to learn from me. So my name is Charly Cox. I'm the co-founder of the Climate Change Coaches, and we have a mission to put coaching in the hands of every environmental leader, be they in organizations or elsewhere in movements and public sector bodies. And what we want to do is to grease the wheels of change, because we recognize that change requires all of the fantastic and incredibly important technical skills that you have, and relational skills to influence and bring other people on board. And that often that relational piece is being done brilliantly by people in this room. But what we hear from people like you a lot is, I don't really know why it works. I don't know why sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. I've got a toolkit for my technical side of things, but I don't have a toolkit for the relational side. Well, we've built the toolkit. Partly we built the toolkit in a training course, and I'll tell you about that a little bit later on very briefly, but also we wrote it into a book. So we wrote the first book on climate change coaching. It came out this summer with Open University Press, and I've got a discount code for you from them that I'll share with you later on. So don't buy it yet if you're thinking of buying it, because you can get 20% off. So really what we wanted to do was bring a very practical coaching approach to the problem of the kind of emotional or psychological barriers you might run up against when you're trying to make change happen. And this week I was in a big insurance company, and somebody said, you know, I went to talk about this thing that to me was so simple. It should have been a 5-minute conversation, and an hour and a half later, we were still talking about it, because clearly for the other person, what was not a simple thing was actually for them an enormous iceberg underneath the water. It meant something. And so they really didn't want to make the change that the other person thought was simple. And I don't know if you've experienced that, but that's when using the skills that we're trained to use can really dig you out of a hole. And we wanted to put those skills in your hands. Hence, we wrote a book. So I'm going to give you a very whistle-stop tour of the kind of top line of what that means today. And for those of you in the room that have trained in coaching or are coaches, I think I can see Catherine Thomas as well, who we trained from NatWest, internal coaches. Please just, you know, smile and nod, because you know this stuff already, but hopefully you'll see how we're applying it outside of coaches with a capital C. So I'm going to try and share my PowerPoint, and let's see if it works. Yay, it works. Fantastic. So how can we galvanize people to act on climate faster and with less effort? And that's really the message I want you to take, because I think that people think of coaching as almost like sort of therapy. We're going to lie on the couch and tell us all about their mothers. And maybe that does happen a little bit, but actually when you use a coaching approach, you can get right to the heart of the issue. So you can stop talking about the topic, which in the case of the person I'm speaking to this week, that was not the issue. There was something bigger going on underneath. So we can help people get there quicker. And I really want to show you how today. These are the common emotional or psychological roadblocks that we come up against. And if you are spotting others in your work, please put it in the chat, because I'm really keen to learn other dimensions of this. So the first is resisting change because it's threatening. This is not just common to climate, this is just change. And in a lot of senses, what I want to share with you today is the idea that you're not working on environmental change, you're working on human change, because it's not the trees or the fish in the Curtis Marine or the polar bears in the big picture that we're trying to change here, it's each other. And when we can use all of the tools we've got available from the years of research on behavior change, then we unlock so much more reasons to change and ways to change. And Kris De Meyer will be talking about that from an academic perspective, I think, later on. And he's absolutely fantastic. So really soak that session up. So we resist it because it's threatening. It triggers our threat response. We resist it because we lack the confidence that our actions count. So some people sort of feel like bystanders naturally and sort of say, well, who am I? I'm just. We feel overwhelmed and at the same time unable to take a risk. So that's the kind of you know, a double blind of, you know, oh, there's so much to do, I don't know where to start, and I can't just start anywhere because it feels too risky. Really commonly in big organizations, we're hearing that it's very difficult to help people connect to a personal stake, a personal reason to care. So, you know, we talk to other teams that we're trying to influence, and they go, yeah, you know, I care about climate change, or I care about the environment, or biodiversity loss, and whatever your framing is. But yeah, but I don't really land it in what I care about. And actually what I really care about is vulnerable people. And of course, there's an enormous link between what's happening in our natural world and those vulnerable people, but people aren't making it. And we can help people connect using a coaching approach. And then finally, the mindset of scarcity and not enough. And boy, is this, I think this is the absolute doozy in this space. There's not enough time, there's not enough people, there's not enough resources. There's no one else around here that cares the way I do. And these may be actual facts. However, there is a difference between the fact, the objective fact of not enough time, for example, and the way we relate to that fact. And frequently we hear that used as a stalling mechanism to stall change, because someone feels disempowered and not up to the challenge. And this is a space in which it's really easy to feel not up to the challenge, because no one single person can solve it. So scarcity it's not about the fact of not enough, it's about the way we relate. And at the Climate Change Coaches, we really fundamentally believe that everything is about the way we relate. It's about the way we relate to ourselves. It's about the way we relate to each other, the way we relate to the natural world, and the way we relate to the crises in the natural world themselves. And when we sit with people and we map those places out, we usually find a broken or a painful link in one of those, which will affect all of that, the health of all the other relationships as well. So if you're in quite a scarce relationship with biodiversity loss, feeling like, you know, there's not enough left, we're losing the things that we love and we're never going to get them back, then while there may be some truth in what you're saying, that feeling of loss and lack might then affect your relationships. And I want to make a distinction here between grief and scarcity. And I want to be very careful to not say that what we're asking you to do is be positive when you don't feel it. What we're asking you to do is own those feelings, because often what people do with their pain and their grief is it comes out in frustration towards other people. And actually, when we can be vulnerable with other people and say, it really upsets me, or it really demotivates me, or I feel real despair and sadness about the state of the world, what we do is we connect. We connect really powerfully when we're vulnerable. And some of you will feel comfortable doing that with some people and not with others, and that's completely fine. But just to be recognizing where your relationship with self is as well, so that you can connect powerfully to other people. And I'm going to explain why connection matters and why it's the tagline of our book shortly. So you will recognize all of these things, but I want to just show them to you anyway. I think we make a big mistake in thinking that everyone except us is in number one, denying there's a problem, ignoring it, just getting on with their lives. Actually, our experience and other people's research would say that's not the case, that very many people, and I'd say this has changed dramatically since 2018 in the IPCC report, very many people are very concerned. So that first place of denying there's a problem, don't worry about those guys. They're probably a vocal but small minority of people. But in number two, there are a lot of people. And this is where it looks like not caring, but actually it's where they're engaged or in relationship, but they don't feel any agency. So they believe something needs to change, but they reduce it. You know, we've got time, or it's probably not as bad as everyone thinks, or as, you know, a relative said to me the other day, things go in cycles. But The other one you often hear is someone else will or should. Big companies need to do that. Big governments need to do that. Well, until China does, da, 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 da. And there is, again, some truth in these statements. Big companies and big governments do need to act. But the reason people are saying them is not because of those truths. It's a stalling mechanism because they feel disempowered. And empowerment and responsibility are two sides of the same coin. And we talk about this in the book, that when people don't feel empowered, they don't take responsibility. So they'll say, it's not my job, when they actually mean, I don't know how, I don't believe I can. And that applies in the workplace, by the way, as much as it applies in this context. Then finally, feeling powerless. And so these are the two big fears that we see in climate. And I'm using that as a catch-all for environment, biodiversity loss, all of those things that you're working on. These big systems threats to the thriving of our world. The two things we hear the most are, who am I to do it? Like, what can I do? And can we do it? And so that feeling of systemic powerlessness as well as individual powerlessness is what is really holding us back in this space. However, when we can get down into action in the current reality, when we can be at peace with how bad it is, and we can take action, which all of you are doing in your day jobs, then we can start to feel a sense of agency, like, well, at least I'm doing something. I know it's not going to be the silver bullet, but I'm doing something. And if we can sustain that action, then it actually looks kind of engaging. People say, oh, have you seen that team? Or have you seen Susan? She looks like she's having a fantastic time in her job. Maybe I'll join, maybe I'll do it. And so that's when we can start to change systems, because when people connect powerfully around an issue, they move like a shoal of fish and they change a system. In governments, it's called trend data. You know, look at all these people who on the doorstep said they cared about climate change. We better make that an issue. Every single one of those people thought they didn't make a difference by saying that to the canvasser. But fundamentally, at stage 4, if people feel isolated and alone, they can go back up into number 2. And that is another really key reason why we need each other here. And, you know, that isolation applies to teams. If you're a small team in a big organization and you feel like nobody else gets it but you, if you don't bond really well as a team and have the ability to talk about that with each other, you can lose teammates. People leave because it's too heartbreaking and it feels like I'm the only one holding this enormous problem. And so at the Climate Change Coaches, a lot of what we do is about connecting people together. So we'd love to believe that our trainings are absolutely stellar on their own and people could do them in isolation at their homes. But actually, before our trainers have even opened their mouths, the fact that people have met on a Zoom call from all over the world and realized all these other people care starts to do some of the work of scaffolding that systems level of belief. So next slide. These are the two. So as I said before, these are the two big, can I do it? Can we do it? Frequently people will say, can I do it? They'll start to believe they can do it. They'll get really close to doing something and then they'll say, oh no, but we can't. If I go and start picking up litter on the beach, by tomorrow, everyone else will have thrown litter back on it. What's the point? So even though I believe I can go and do it, I don't believe people will join me. This sort of cynicism about people's good intentions is really sad. And we understand where it comes from. It comes from our response to change and feeling overwhelmed. And I think one thing I was aware of, I just want to throw this in, is that actually we have a job to do in a paradigm shift sense, to move from a grasping paradigm that is self-serving to a paradigm of love. It's a very bold word to use among technical people, but I'm going to. There's a story that Tara Brach tells of a man who wins a golf competition and he's given a lot of prize money. And as he's leaving in the car park, a woman comes up to him and says, please, my baby is ill in hospital with cancer and I don't have the money for the treatment. And he says, that's absolutely dreadful. Please take my prize money. And a few days later, someone else comes up to him and says, listen, I saw you leaving the other day and I saw that woman coming up to you. And by the way, you know, that's a scam. You know that there, you know, she does that all the time. She's a complete con artist. And he said, you mean there's no baby dying of cancer? And the other man said, yes. And he said, thank goodness for that. And that's the shift. From this expecting others to be somehow bad and wrong, to seeing the goodness, to finding the love. So, what do we need to do? 3 things. Rather than talk and share, we need to listen, acknowledge, and champion. And I'm going to explain what I mean by that. So, listen. And here the coaching skill of paraphrasing is kind of useful. It sounds like you feel stuck when it comes to this. Acknowledge, that's pretty normal. I mean, that's one of the most important things you can do, is tell people they're being sane to feel this way. This really is hard. You really care about this. So acknowledge who someone is. This doesn't feel like anything. It feels like you're doing nothing. But this is probably the most important skill for defeating fear, because it soothes people's threat response back into a place of safety. And then 3rd, championing. You know, I know you to be a really strategic thinker, to be really thoughtful, to really care about this issue. You're reminding people who they are. You're helping them get past their fear. Their fear's doing the talking. Try and push it out of the way. And this is the way you do that. What we actually do is this. Someone tells us an issue. We think, I'm not going to talk about that emotional stuff. That's really scary and sticky. I'm going to go right to, well, have you tried? Pretty much. So it looks like this. This is purposely vague because it could apply to me trying to insulate my house, or a team in a big organization trying to make change. People say, I just don't know where to start. It's all so complex. And typically we do one of 3 things. We counsel in the sense of giving advice. We collude in the sense of telling them they're right not to do anything, or we clash. Now, counselling, I would say, is the most common face-to-face in a work context. Colluding is probably the most common at the school gates and in a personal context. And clashing happens online. We don't like causing conflict face-to-face, but boy, do we clash on Twitter and LinkedIn. We just got to get on with it. Pull your finger out, you know. And actually, what we could do is coach. Coaches do it this way. We say, yeah, we hear the issue. Just stick that over there for a minute. We're going to focus on the emotion first, because if we can change your relationship emotionally, we can get to action in seconds. We don't need to hear the ins and outs of whether you're going to get loft insulation or underfloor insulation and how much a heat pump costs. We don't need any of that stuff, Charlie. We just need to know how you're feeling. And I'll explain it like this. So I just don't know where to start. It's all so complex. What about an approach where we say, it sounds like you're feeling overwhelmed? And if that person agrees, or if they say, no, I'm actually feeling this, you chase that emotion down. So how have you overcome overwhelm in the past? Now, they may say very commonly, oh, this is totally different though. You know, well, actually, no, it's not. Just stay with me for a sec. And if it's no use to you, just chuck it out. But just for a second, stay with me. Tell me how you've overcome overwhelm in the past. And then someone will give you their strategy for how they did it once before, because people have the resources within themselves. They just don't believe they do. And once they've got that roadmap, you say, okay, how does that map onto this situation? And it might not map perfectly, but what you've done is less provide the solution and more remind them that they know how to solve problems. And then they start to believe in themselves again. And belief is what we need here. And you can do this with the system level. Tell me when humanity's overcome a big issue, or when humanity's made a massive change, nothing to do with the environment. It could be the abolition of slavery. That's a real favorite one for some of my clients. That really returns them to we can do the right thing when we want to. Often you hear people talk about CFCs in this space, don't you, for that reason. So we can place the relationship at the heart of the discussion. frequently what we're doing here is we're putting the issue first. I'm here to convince you to do this thing. And actually, the way to get that influencing to work really well is to have a really great relationship. I can say really tough things to my clients. I still coach 1 day a week, and I can be really challenging with them because we have a really good relationship. They know I care. They know I'm not just being mean. And it's that depth of relationship that you can build. People tell me all the time they're fed up of Zoom calls, but they like coaching calls on Zoom. How does that work? Well, in coaching, they get listened to really well. They get to finish a complete sentence, unlike most of the other calls they do. And they get to say what they really mean and be helped think about their own insights. Now, I'm not suggesting that all of you become coaches, but if you could just borrow just 2% of what coaches do, then you could start to address those emotional roadblocks that are getting in the way of you making real impact and fast. So this is the free stuff, or the discounts. We run a training course, a mini baby training course, only 3 sessions, 6 hours in November. And if you put the code dialogue in when you go to buy it, I'm reliably informed that you'll get 20% off that course. I'm actually teaching that course. Unusually, I don't tend to teach our public courses. We also have a coach training program that started yesterday. The next one will be in March, and that's for already trained coaches to develop their skills. And it's lovely to see some people here today who did that course. And then finally, McGraw-Hill, who own Open University Press, have very kindly given us a discount code for our book. So if you go to mheeducation.co.uk, and I'll put the full link into the chat so you've got that, then you can get 20% off the book as well, which will probably cover the postage, which would be quite nice. And that's print on demand. So wherever you are in the UK, there's stacks of them. But if you're in another territory, I'm reliably informed that it won't be shipped from the UK with a huge carbon footprint. It will be printed in your territory. So that's good. We had long conversations about how to make the book itself not damaging. So that's really all I wanted to say. And apologies if you know all this stuff already and it feels really commonplace. I hope that there's some little nugget of something that you can take today and start to apply immediately. At the Climate Change Coaches, we are deeply practical. Everything we do is based on our experience of coaching people or training people. And we always want people to leave with at least one thing that within the next few hours of leaving us, they can use. So I would really love it if you'd put into the chat the one thing that you think you can use from this session. I'm going to stop my slides as you do that.
Great, thank you for that, Charlie. We've got a few questions in chat for you. The first question is, are there ways we can coach when doing the broadcast type of information sharing, for example, web articles and press releases, etc.?
So broadcast means like written, not as in there's no actual conversation, not like this, not like a speech.
I presume that's what they mean, the 2 examples of web articles and press releases. So, yeah. So
I would really tell you to go and look at the Common Cause Foundation's work on values, because and we've got a values chapter in our book that Tom Crompton from Common Cause helped me to write. And they've done some really interesting research into how to talk about things like volunteering, for example. Frequently, people were making posters about volunteering saying, come and volunteer, it'll be good for your CV. But when they spoke to volunteers about what they actually got from the experience, they said camaraderie, a sense of purpose, a sense of putting something back. And so that became what was put on the posters. So in a very simple level, speak to people's intrinsic values for acting, not their extrinsic values around gaining. Because Tom's research would say that that's more successful. It's just that we assume that while we're intrinsically motivated, other people are extrinsically motivated. So I'm motivated to do my job because it feels really purposeful, but everyone else is just doing their jobs for the money. So that would be one thing. And you can ask questions in your broadcast. You can say, you know, what would it be like if we had a world like, You know, we always talk to people about building a dream to run towards, not a nightmare to run away from. And frequently in this space, we're depicting a nightmare to run away from because we ourselves are a bit frightened. And I've done that many times. But actually, if we can start to talk about the dream we want to run towards, then we can help people to see something positive that they want to engage with. I don't know if that helps. Yeah,
great. Thank you, Charlie. Another question was, in some cases, is there a sense of how much repetition is required to make change? I can imagine using some of these techniques with the old guard and being laughed out of the room, as much as I agree with the concept myself.
Because it's talking about feelings, do you think?
I guess that's probably what they were thinking.
Yeah. Oh, well, I mean, we work in big corporates, so we've probably got a lot of different words for feelings. I remember talking to someone once who said, like, I have a very thinking preference. And so I remember joking, you know, if you thought you had a feeling, what do you think that feeling would be? You know, and you can phrase this in very practical nuts and bolts ways. Don't be attached to the language, you know, be attached to the concept. You know, I've got to find out what is holding this person back. So 2 questions that are absolutely invaluable, that are almost the same question, slightly different words. What matters to you about that? What's important to you about that? And those questions will get you right to values. And they're very plain speak. I mean, I defy anyone to say that's woo-woo, to say what's important to you about that, Tom, and see what he says in return. So I would definitely don't feel that you have to suddenly put on the kind of, you know, the therapist voice and how are you feeling, you know, because people do think they have to do that, and you don't, just be you. But don't spend hours going round and round the houses on the topic, because you're not going to get traction there. You need to find out what's going on. And that's only in a place where there's a sense of charge. If you're having a conversation and it's just really easy and everything's working, you probably don't need to do it. But if it's feeling difficult for some reason and you're feeling a tussle, stop fighting, you know, stop fighting their fear, because their fear will always win. Instead, find out what's going on, because probably they're holding on to something very important to them that they're worried is under threat.
Thanks, Charlie. Probably only time for one more question now. So are not many of the people that we need to persuade somehow distant from us, either privileged and powerful or disenchanted and disempowered? Are they not the 2 groups that need to be persuaded?
So persuaded is an interesting word, isn't it? I don't know how to, so there's 2 different groups there. There's the kind of, so what I would say is that question shows something interesting about your relationship with those 2 groups. And so I would want you to ask yourself, what is my perspective on people who are powerful? And what's my perspective on people who are disempowered? Because that will give you some of the answer. Because actually, if there's a mindset there, you can change that mindset. So for example, there might be a mindset that people in power are more powerful than me and are, I'm not saying this is how you feel, but they're kind of a different breed and they have completely different priorities to me. And that's a mindset, and that will affect the way you show up in conversations with those people. My experience of working with some of those people is that they take you aside and they, you know, say, you know, you're doing the real work. I'm just moving loads of money around, you know, or I'm really worried because I've got little kids. I hear that a lot. So I think, no, just think about what the perspective is on those people and how you can return to believing that they're just humans like everybody else. And then the other group, I suppose I'd want to think about empathy. So you may not feel disempowered around the climate crisis or the environmental crisis, but you probably have felt disempowered about something at some point. So when have you felt powerless? What was that like? How did you behave when that happened? And then how can you have some empathy for them that might start to give you some keys to what to do? It's not just about feeling empathy, that's very nice, but it gives you an understanding. So frequently at the beginning of we have a modular training program for organizations. The organizations can pick and choose from 9 modules. And we start almost every one by asking, like, when have you felt this? When have you resisted change? When have you felt scarcity? Because it opens up a kind of like, oh yeah. And what did you need when that happened? And frequently the answer is not what you yourself would have done with someone else. You know, what you needed was to be understood, and to have it normalized. What you didn't need was to be given loads of advice. But if we started the session by saying, what would you do in this situation? I'd put money on the fact that everyone would say I'd give them loads of advice, because that's just hardwired into us as humans to do that. And as coaches, we have to have it pretty much kicked out of us in coach training. So empathy, I would say, would probably be the big starting point. We're all humans at the end of the day. We've all got a stake, even those who haven't worked it out yet. We're all on this rock. We've all got a stake.
Great. Thank you so much for that, Charlie. Really appreciate the really interesting talk. So thank you everyone as well who's put comments in chat. Unfortunately, we don't have time for Charlie to respond to all of them, but there's some really great questions, and also just some great discussion that's happening there in chat. So now it's time for us to move on to Diana's talk. Diana has over 25 years experience in training and facilitating innovative stakeholder dialogue. She set up Dialogue Matters in 2000, which has since trained 2,000 people in facilitating effective dialogue and engagement to help create positive actions for future, for nature, climate, and people. Over to you, Diana.
Great, thank you. It's funny to hear myself introduced on something I've put together. Anyway, there we go. So my talk has got overlaps and echoes of so much of what has been already discussed today. And I knew some of what was going to be discussed or presented, and I wanted to sort of try and come in and complement that a bit. So I'm coming with some different, maybe some different insights. And so I'm going to talk about being inspiring a bit. So being hopeful, focusing on the possible and the better future, understanding bits of human nature, though we've heard lots of that already, but I'll just whisk through those slides because I think they might either repeat, which can always help us to grasp a point, or maybe be another slide, another perception. And then about being, what does it mean to being ethical and powerful and contagious and kind? So first of all, being hopeful. And I think this is really hard. We work in Dialogue Matters on the front line. Last year it was dolphins and whales in real trouble in the Med and the Black Sea. We've worked this year on bat strategy for the UK and how bat species are desperately in trouble. We've been doing some landscape work in a couple of different projects and hearing the presented in quite a normal voice, but deep concern and passion for place that people hold, and worries about the trouble that's in with drought and climate change and everything. So as a team, we're on the front line all the time of hearing right across such a huge spectrum of different subjects. I don't know, coral reef conservation, seeing people in tears in the Caribbean as they talked about the coral reefs near their island being trashed. And it's hard. So, but I choose to be hopeful, and I think it genuinely is a choice. So here's a couple of quotes. Hope is an embrace of the unknown and the unknowable. It's the belief that what we do matters, even though how and when it may matter and what and who it may impact are not things we can know beforehand, and maybe never will. And hope is not something you have. Hope is something you create with your actions. And so I choose to act and be hopeful. But I also am very aware that there are actually some reasons to be hopeful. And we're very, very good as environmentalists at not looking at those things. So many years ago, we were doing, when there were regions in England, and we were doing regional strategies. And we said to what in one workshop, we are in proposing the workshop, we said we want to be asking people about the success stories in this area. And we were told, no, there's only about 4 or 5, and we know what they all are by this group of people from the different agencies. No, there's no point doing that. Well, we did it anyway, and we got 75 success stories, no repeats of great things happening. So they were very, the steering group were very alive to all the audits they were making about loss and catastrophes and pollution events and development on top of a sensitive site and all of those kinds of things, but they weren't auditing in any way the success stories. So we are very good at filtering for the negative. This is part of how our brains are wired. It's not just being environmentalists, but good at filtering for the negative. But there's some good stuff happening. So research suggests that 25% of a group thinking or doing differently is enough to tip the whole group. Right. So what of concern for climate nature? How close do you think we might be to that 25%? Well, actually, it's incredibly good news. So this is about climate care. So this was back in 2020, 80,000 people surveyed from across the world. 97% think climate change is serious, and 70% said it was very serious. And in some countries, it was 80 or 90% who said it's very serious. And they weren't necessarily the countries that you might imagine. So the UK is right over, I don't know if my cursor can work on this, I don't know if you can see that, but the UK is right down here. So actually the numbers, these countries over here are places like Kenya, and I can't read it well enough. Anyway, all sorts of places that sometimes I think the UK sort of privileges itself and think that somehow we're out in front of everybody else. We most certainly are not in many ways. But anyway, look at that. Huge number of people. If it's 25% tip, we've tipped on climate change. And then Futera did a survey in May 2020. So in the UK, we're in the depths of lockdown. It's really grim. And they did this survey and found 77% of people in the US and UK believe we should make as many lifestyle changes to stop climate change as we're making to stop COVID. And they believe the lifestyle changes needed will improve their quality of life or make no difference. They're not seeing it as detrimental. That's brilliant news. What about nature? This is just a UK one, and it was released just a couple of weeks ago. So 81% of people in the UK believe nature is under threat, and 48% say they're willing to take action themselves to reverse the damage. So that's fantastic news. We've got all this concern, and we've been learning today about ways that we can turn that concern into action. And then in terms of the resources ourselves, so in late September this year, there was evidence that nature is not seen as an impediment to economic growth, or there's evidence that it's not, should I say, an impediment to economic growth. Of course, a lot of people think it is, but there's evidence that it's not. On the 27th, bison, bears, beavers, elk, wolves, humpback whales, bearded vulture, white-tailed eagles are back from the brink in Europe. And a little earlier in September, but still, less than a month ago, 116 big business wrote to Liz Truss and asked for robust net zero plans. And who might you think would be doing that? Well, I bet you wouldn't have put your money on Amazon, Coca-Cola, Sky, IKEA maybe, they're pretty green, Aviva and Zurich Insurance, and many, many other names that you would have heard about. There's lots of good news out there. Why don't we see it? Why don't we encourage ourselves with it? If you're linked in with me, you will know that when I see something like this, I share it. In fact, I shared all these 3 stories. So we've got to encourage ourselves with where there's good news as well. We're also coming to the end of an era, which is obviously pretty challenging. But I heard somebody a few years back presenting on how we are at the end of the fossil fuel era. And we're at the end of an industrial sort of phase. So there's, depending who you talk to, we've had multiple industrial revolutions, and we are in the cusp of another one. And so apparently it takes 3 things to converge to be in an industrial sort of revolution of that kind. A change in communication. We've obviously over the last 20 years gone from paper to the internet. A change in energy, and we're making big shifts from fossil fuels to renewables and batteries. And a change in mobility and logistics, and we're shifting to the sharing economy, AI, Internet of Things. And this time, what is even more exciting people who understand all this far better than I do, is not just that it's these 3 things are changing, but there's a convergence because it's all changing in and around the digital revolution. And so with the end of fossil fuels, we've actually got that now renewable is so much more cost effective than fossil fuels that there are a lot of people in fossil fuel world, and I've visited a few conversations, international conversations amongst business people, and there is quite a bit of panic about stranded assets. Now, at the moment, they're obviously having a little bit of an uptick, but just a few days ago, there was a report the Ukraine war will boost climate action in relation to shifts in energy. So yes, we're going more to gas and so on at the moment, but and coal and fossil fuel energy, but this is almost its last gasp, because if you want fuel security, energy security, you're not going to pursue fossil fuel. There's a lot of stranded assets out there, and a lot of people very worried about that. There was an article in The Guardian this morning, I didn't have a chance to get it in the presentation, but about from Mark Carney, who used to be Bank of England. If you see that in The Guardian, have a read. So the situation is far from hopeless. From exponential growth of green solutions to the power of process, experts say there's a clear path to limiting the damage. We're in a race between Armageddon and awesome. I say let's pick awesome. And we need to find and to trigger the tipping points in a way to create the necessary acceleration of change. And that might be technical tipping points, but it might also be these social, psychological tipping points we're talking about. So that's about being hopeful. And this is actually comes right in on something Charlie just said, which is about a positive vision. So those two pictures, the top one, I was in Delhi doing some work with some of my colleagues and training people in participatory policy making. And that was taken out of my hotel window. And if I'd taken a picture out the other window, I would have seen, well, I would have not seen that hotel in the bottom picture because that was during COVID and I wasn't there during COVID, but that was in the other direction. And that's the difference in the air quality in that exact location. So what inspires us? The air is 2050, the world is on fire, the air is suffocating and deadly, entire countries are underwater. Or the year is 2050, the world is breathing, the air is fresh, nature is thriving, entire populations have a better quality of life. Which motivates? Well, it actually turns out, if you do research with environmentalists, about, I can't remember the figure, but maybe it's about 20% are driven by that that doom and gloom, that very awful future. But the majority of us and the majority of other people are motivated by the positive future vision. And here's a lovely quote: a compelling vision is like a hook in the future. It connects you to pockets of possibility that are emerging and pulls them into the present. So hold on to that. And here's a few slides about understanding human nature. And as I say, some of these do resonate with things that have already been said, but a couple of them are new, I think. So there's this focus. So people have this natural bias to short-termism and localism. And I saw in the chat that somebody said, well, in certain indigenous peoples, they would think 7 generations forwards, and that's just amazing. And we need to be mindful that some of these claims about how people work are from Western science and Western psychology and Western research. And I'm fully aware that other indigenous peoples and other cultures see things differently. So maybe it should say westernized people have a natural bias to short-term and local. So don't focus on the big picture in the long term, because why not? Because environmental complexity and scale is overwhelming. So then you can talk about a long-term vision, but then you connect with the here and now. And if any of you've been to any of our workshops, the first thing we always talk about is a positive vision, and then bring people to the now and say, what are you doing to get there? What more could you do? What new ideas have you got? So let's look at the positive vision, but let's look at what we're doing now and how we amplify and ramp that up and do that more. So people desire autonomy and control. So if you use power to override or push or coerce to get your way, then it utterly threatens autonomy. You can get short-term compliance, but you're more likely then to trigger resistance and reactance. And reactance is when people do the opposite as a way of really reclaiming their agency. They will do the opposite of what you're suggesting. So it's relating as equals, understanding their perspective, discussing and sharing possible solutions and ideas with people. People are very driven to maintain their self-esteem. Apparently it's a bigger drive for us psychologically than sex is. So like it's a pretty big drive. It's very important to us. So if you engage in eco and climate shaming of individuals, and I default to this, and some of my team members will know I even did it the other day, so I'm very sorry about that. But people will then feel judged, and it triggers cognitive dissonance. And cognitive dissonance means that, well, if I think I'm a good person, but you're telling me I'm doing something around climate or nature that is not good, then something's not right here. And our brains scramble to restore our self-esteem. And the only solution in that conundrum is to believe that the facts are wrong, but what they're being presented with is wrong. So don't do that eco-shaming. Use I language, which means you're speaking from your own experiences, being curious and uncovering their pro-environmental actions, acknowledge and appreciate. We've just heard some of this much more beautifully expressed by Charlie. And then happiness. We want to pursue happiness. We want to avoid negative emotions. And we've heard that already today as well. So don't focus on the doom and gloom. It triggers this threat and fear responses, aversion, avoidance, denial, hyperdefensiveness, or it can now trigger the opposite, which is hyperfocus, depression, direct activism, which absolutely has its place. But let's tell our stories of action and success and progress and hope to inspire and motivate each other and catalyse those actions. I just want to very quickly touch on this slide, which underpins an awful lot of the way we design dialogue. So this came from some research where they had various communities around forest research and forest management. And they asked some, what's the problem with forest management and how do we fix it? And they asked others, what's working well and how could we do more? And look at the unbelievable difference in the psychology of the group. So with the problem solving, people were frustrated. They felt anything good they were doing around the forest wasn't even recognised. It wasn't valued. It's all very complex and difficult. It's a problem. They felt overwhelmed. They felt risk averse. They disowned. It's not our problem. It's the government or the Forest Commission or somebody else's. And they had no momentum or resistance to change. And on the other side, where the questions were around what's working, what's your long-term visions, what's getting you there, what more could you do? People felt motivated. They felt their efforts were valued. Looking after the environment has many benefits. They believed in their capacity to make a difference. It fostered innovation. They were willing to get involved to make a difference, and there was momentum for delivery. So whenever I look at this, I think people, environmentalists, those of us who are, that is our career being environmentalists, we've been so wallowing around in the problem. What's the problem and how do we fix it? It's the approach we take to everything. And it's actually causing some of the barriers and difficulties and aversions and risk averseness that is the very issue that then gets us really frustrated, and just asking questions differently. So those of you, I know there's some people on the call we've done participatory dialogue processes for, and you will now recognise this, that we have asked at the beginning, what is the vision? Where are you all trying to get to? And then we ask questions about what you're already doing that's getting you there. What more could you do? And build up from there towards action and commitment. And then be ethical. What was that? Be ethical, what I said? Ethical, powerful, contagious, and kind. So what do I mean by this? So ethical is obviously do as you would be done by. Be respectful, be open-minded and curious to others. It's a real privilege to go and have conversations with people who are not like you. So walk in their shoes. Why do they think those ways? Why do they have those values? And connect with what motivates them. Use your superpower. So if you're on this call, you care about life on Earth. You might know it very well, you might be an expert in it, or you might not. You might be, I know there's some people here from communities, you still care. So speak from that deep love. You'll be authentic and trustworthy, and you're speaking from your core, and you can connect. And so weave that in. You can weave your knowledge about nature in using everyday language. And be contagious, which I first created this slide in the middle of COVID, which didn't really seem like a very good slide to be saying be contagious, but there you go. And we've heard this today, that behaviour is very contagious. And there was this website that was set up to show where solar panels were in an area, and it occurred in clusters. And it turned out green energy is even more contagious than drinking alcohol or smoking tobacco. So make any choices you are making yourself visible to others. You can influence 3 degrees, so your friends, their friends, and their friends' friends. So let's be doing that. Being authentic and honest, so practicing what you preach. So if you're preaching some environmental, well, let's not be preaching at all after what we've heard today. We shouldn't be preaching at all. But be authentic in what you yourself are pursuing around living in a way that is more nature and climate friendly and social justice friendly. And the more you influence yourself, and I wrote this slide, I don't know, a couple of years back, but now I understand that self-persuasion journey. I understand what's going on here, that if you stop eating meat, you might start wondering if you should also be eating dairy. So in that theme of food, you're going up a sort of self-persuasion journey in the context of food. And so keep doing that and influencing your own choices. And then this is be kind, and this isn't a particularly attractive slide, but there's this theory, and of course these are all models and theories and contested and all the rest of it, but this is a theory about how new ideas sort of percolate and diffuse across society or across an organization. And there's this pattern of the innovators, then the early adopters, the majority, early majority, late majority, and laggards. And to be here, you're going to be an innovator or an early adopter. So hooray for that. But then that means that we are thinking quite differently from the majority of everybody else. And so then when we come across those people, it's about being kind and recognizing we've just got ourselves, for whatever serendipity, to a place that they're not at in relation to nature and climate. So again, it's about being respectful and listening and understanding and being empathetic. And then this is another model which comes from counselling world. And it's again, it's a model, it's contested and so on. However, it's this idea that on this side, sorry, I've just got to move your, okay, so here. So something happens, and if it's a good thing and you feel good, you've got excitement and your mood raises, and then you might actually plunge into down here, into uncertainty, and because you've had a big adjustment, a big thing happens. So that could be, I don't know, winning the lottery, moving house, getting married, or something like that. Good, some positive good thing has happened, but you're still likely to hit some period of not feeling so good about things through adjustment. If it's a shocking thing, then you obviously plunge down. You might go back up again as you minimize and deny what's going on, and then you plunge down again. And I know a group of people who are absolutely in the crisis part of all of this around climate and nature, and seem to me locking themselves into it. And that really worries me. But I have to be acknowledging that, I came to this decades and decades ago when I did my environmental science degree, and we used to come out of lectures and we did used to joke. And this is decades and decades before anybody else really, this is more than 4 decades ago. I'll be giving away my age if I'm not careful. But and people were, nobody was talking about environment at all. And we'd have a day of, every day was bad news about toxic substances in the environment, about global warming, about loss of species, about water pollution. Day after day, year after year, hearing bad news. And we did used to joke, oh, that's another sort of, might as well end the day now. Should we go to the copy shop, or should we commit suicide? What should we do? And we used a lot of black humor around that. So I've gone through this distress and despair, minimizing or denying, when I was at university decades ago, and I've pushed myself up, or got myself up to sort of transformation and confidence and trying to move forward. I'm not saying I don't revisit some of these stages and loops. When the IPCC report came out, I sat in the garden and cried for about 2 days. But you have got to pick yourself up and dust yourself off, and accept and live with those feelings, but there is work to be done as well. So it's about being kind to where other people are on this journey. And if they are in the absolute pit of depression and crisis, that's where they are. And let's just listen to that and comfort them. We've just had some wonderful advice from Livvy about coaching approaches to enable that. But let ourselves also be looking to come out of this with the new confidence and transformative approaches, and not get locked into this reinforcing the crisis, an extended crisis, or even giving up and quitting, which is where we have young people committing suicide. We can't have this. We've got to be finding ways to adapt psychologically. So our individual boundaries are porous. We infect each other with ills and joys. So let's infect each other with stubborn optimism and determined action. So I will ask, what will you do? And because time's against us, I'm not now going to sit here for 2 minutes and say, what will you do, and ask you to write something down. But I hope that you will leave today with things you will do. We will send these round, but keep your spirits up. Actively seek out the good news. Your brain and the media know your brain is wired to search out bad news. That's why the majority of media is bad news, because that sells. So actively seek out the good news stories and share the good news stories when you find them. Sign up to some of these, read some of these books. We can get this list to people afterwards. And your immediate actions are going to be to go into groups and engage in some of the interactive sessions that we've got coming up. Before I speak to that, Joel, is there time for questions, or is it time to move straight on?
We do have time for 1 or 2.
Okay.
This was a question that was asked when you were sharing some of the statistics and research towards the beginning of your talk. And someone responded as well. So I'll read both of the question and comment out. So Then why has the government decided to award more than 100 new licenses for oil and gas drilling in the North Sea? It may be a last gasp, but it could be the last gasp that tips us over the edge. And additionally to that, another person commented, exactly, that's the elephant that isn't being addressed. If 87% isn't enough, how many more do we need? Or do we just need the same money as the people government does listen to?
Wow, okay, huge questions. I think we also acknowledge something that has not been talked about today, which is actually it's the fossil fuel lobby that challenged, that put out lots of media to convince us all about our carbon footprint. The notion of carbon footprint came from the fossil fuel lobby. And part of their motivation for that was to outsource responsibility and guilt and shame and worry out from themselves. But it was also with another motivation. And it was a motivation that we would all be terribly busy doing small actions and be too busy to lobby, to vote, to divest and shift where your money is, to do maybe the more difficult things. And so when people say to me, what can I do? I don't immediately reverse to recycling or walking to work. I say the first thing to do is, where's your money going? And the second thing is, where are you voting? Where are you putting your political power? Are you lobbying people? Are you influencing at that level? Do I think this is the last gasp of the fossil fuel? Yeah, actually it is. Truss used to work I'm talking UK here. So Truss used to work for, she was an economist in Shell, I think it was, one of the big fossil fuels. She's there, they got her in. Don't make no mistakes. That crowd are in power at the moment because of the money that has been invested in getting them there in the interests of fossil fuel. But be hopeful, look at what's happening politically, look at how many people want them out. It is not going to last much longer before we end up with a shift in party. So yes, it's it is their last gasp. But in any case, by the time you've let licenses, and I had the privilege of sharing dinner with somebody, he was telling me, don't worry about fracking, that's never going to happen. Don't worry about this, it won't happen. I don't know whether he's right or he's wrong, but some of his statistics and some of his understanding of what's going on is that's sort of some of it's appeasing certain lobbyists and certain funders, but it won't end up happening because the investment won't be worth making. So let's try and be hopeful about that.
Great, thank you, Diana. Probably just time for one more. Can you explain what you mean by eco-shaming? Are you suggesting this approach for companies as well, or just individuals?
I don't think it works for anybody because it in any context, because it just causes these aversive psychological responses. But by eco-shaming, I mean, at Christmas, whenever I was last able to go to a dinner at Christmas, somebody said, oh, you're an environmentalist, and instantly told me how they were recycling. I said, oh, that's great. Is there anything else you're thinking of doing differently around nature and environment? Is there anything else on your radar? She said, oh, well, I'm to wonder about flying. I fly about I go on holiday 7 times a year. And I had to bite my lip very hard not to say, are you kidding me? How could you be doing that? Do you not care about nature and the planet? That would have been eco-shaming. I also recently heard about somebody who flies to America for 2-hour meetings. So they get a plane out to America, do their 2-hour meeting and come back again. And I have to say, I couldn't contain myself. I tried to not make it my view. I said, I've got some environmental friends that would really quite struggle with that idea of whether the corporation you're doing that work for will even exist if people continue to behave like that in 50 years' time. So I'm afraid I did slightly go into the eco-guilting and shaming track there. So it's difficult, it's hard, I acknowledge I do it, but it's just anything that makes you sort of look like you're the superior party and got the moral high ground, and you're making somebody else feel bad about themselves for doing it. And I guess I would just caveat the thing about organisations. Do organisations need to be called out? Absolutely they do. But as a general tactic, I don't think, if you're trying to bring people along and bring people on side, I don't think challenging them with everything they're doing wrong is likely to work. I think finding out what they're doing right and asking them how they could do that more or be supported to do more will work, because you're working with the grain of human nature there, not against it.
Great, thank you, Diana. Again, lots of really great discussion that was going on in chat during the talk. So thank you everybody for your contributions there. Unfortunately, we don't have any more time for further questions.